for Corvallis Albany Farmers Markets. I'll do my own introduction this week. Maybe I won't mess up this one. I arrived in Oregon in January of 1991, and by February of 1991, I had been roped into helping to start the Corvallis Farmers Market on Saturday. I live in an 1890 farmhouse, and I've had a varied career before farmers markets. I had a varied career in journalism and government and academia and all that stuff that nobody really cares about today. I have been running markets in some capacity since 1995, and I have done a lot of work at the legislature to try to work on the same thing we're talking about today, the regulation and deregulation of farmers markets and their vendors. So I think that's plenty of introduction here. So today's talk is called Food Regulation and Deregulation, Exploring New Products One Step at a Time. By the way, where are they saying this? Over there. All right. So it's always good to figure out what it is we're trying to do today. We'll see if we can get through all of this. We want to make sure that you get some knowledge of some of the laws that affect market vendors, that you get an understanding that it gets more complex when you get some freedom, not less complex. It would seem like it would get simpler, but the more exemptions and things you get, actually the more complicated it can be. And that's why we have to actually have a workshop every now and again. And I want you to be able to identify some opportunities that this might provide for you, or maybe you'll just say, hey, I don't want any part of this, but that's good for me to know. And also, hopefully, you'll have some idea where to find the information yourself later. Okay, so a little bit of history. Back when I started in the 20th century, pretty much anything that you did to food that you grew might be considered food processing and somehow subject to licensing by either the state or a county. I used to joke that if you looked at food too hard, that you might be in licensing land. So just some examples. What did this mean? Weird things came out of this. If you were growing beans for drying and you wanted to dry them inside your house, that was food processing. Or take the crumbly stuff that had already dried off of your dried beans. This did not make any sense. We eventually fixed that. Another example is that there was a rule. I mean, even farmers markets themselves, what legal basis did we have? It was kind of squishy. There was an administrative rule about farm stands saying you could sell your own produce on your own land, and that's a problem because a lot of us have leased land right there. And it said something about certain unusual other venues might be okay. And it had a typo in it. It was missing the word not. And so it said that these other places, which might be farmers markets, were okay to sell food, but only if they harmed the public health. So it stayed that way for 15 years while I complained about this word not. And finally, somehow, when it didn't matter anymore, they took it out. Okay, so that's the old history. I'm going to skip over a lot because this isn't a history lesson here. But when did things start to change? In 2009, I think in the fall, I got a phone call that we were going to be called before a House Agriculture Committee to talk about problems. And they sent us into to work on this in pretty much the whole year 2010. All the different parties in food processing and farmers markets got into a room several times, and we hashed some things out. It's called a work group to resolve these legal issues. And so the result was in 2011, I helped pass a bill that we call the Farm Direct Law, and that was followed in 2015 by the Home Bakery and Confection Law, which I helped with, but it was not as responsible for. And in that same ballpark, there were some poultry slaughter changes as well. By the way, I wanted to say to those of you who are meat producers here, I'm going to try to say some things so it's not all about veg, but I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here today, and then I'm afraid some of it is going to be boring to all of you. And we'll do the best we can here. So a little more in those two laws. The 2011 Farm Direct Law is sometimes called by others a cottage foods law. And I want to clarify it is not a cottage foods law because it's a Farm Direct law. you have to grow the principal ingredients of anything under this law for it to be under this law. Cottage foods law might be a better way to describe the bakery bill that came around later. But it's all about changing things that you grew into other forms to sell them and maybe make some more money. So in 2015, the approach changed to look at the bakery and the confectionery. And why is this different? Well, one thing is there are a lot of places in the rural parts of Oregon where you can't get a loaf of bread without driving 100 miles. But yet there were people baking and things were happening. You know, people weren't really driving the 100 miles all the time. So this allows small business operations everywhere in the state, but I felt it was particularly a wonderful thing for the rural areas of the state to have the economic development of the bakery bill and also just get more access to more food. There was a big focus when we passed the bill, and even today, on the part of the bill that's about the stuff in jars. That's jams and pickles and that kind of thing. That got the huge public focus. That was where all the controversy was. Meanwhile, there was a lot of other cool stuff in the bill that we're going to go over today that may actually help just as many farmers and customers. You can do dried fruits and vegetables. The beans and grains problems were eliminated that I referred to with the beans. And I think these things are really important, but they're not as sexy as the stuff in jars for some reason. Okay, so here are some benefits that were reported by participants in a study. I think when we were at 5 years out from the bill passing, OSU put a graduate student on this, and her name is Lindsay Trant. Some of you may know her. She later worked for Friends of Family Farmers. Lindsay went and interviewed both farmers and market managers, and here are some of the things that were reported as benefits of the law. By the way, Lindsay, I think, was the committee administrator of the committee where the whole thing started. Just a little fun historical fact. Okay, well, one thing everyone agrees that you can reduce some food waste because you can process some foods that are they're not bad, but they're maybe not cosmetically beautiful, and they might be really nice looking in a jar. For small vendors, they can boost the variety that are in their stalls. That's in their stalls. That's true for anyone, but it's especially meaningful for a small farmers market vendor. And they reported that they felt like they could compete better with the larger vendors in the markets that they sold in. Season extension, you can come to more weeks of the market if you have some things that are not fresh, and that has proved to provide a little bit more income for people if they can eke out a few more weeks of the market. It's, you know, the reason that we press to have this stuff added to the law is to let farmers experiment. It's really expensive to start these things under the old way, the licensing way. And how do you know if you really want to do all that? You need a way to experiment that's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. And you may find out that this just isn't for you. Renting a kitchen, we heard from the respondents in the study, is just not feasible in all places. And there are a number of reasons why. It may work for you or it may not work for you. I want to go over a couple of the limits that are in the law. This may seem ridiculous. They wanted to have a dollar limit. So we gave them a ridiculously high number, which is $20,000 a year in the stuff in jars. If you got even close to $20,000, you wouldn't be able to do it in your home anymore. So, but still, being the sort of policy wonk that I am, I insisted that they put an inflation adjustment on the 20,000 just so that it doesn't shrink to nothing over time. So there's this is one of these cases where deregulation does not mean no regulation. It means less regulation. Especially where you're talking about the acidified things, which would be the vinegar pickles, salsas, things like that. You're going to have to do a lot of record keeping, and you have to be able to back up that you've sold less than 20,000, as ridiculous as that may sound. One of the most important things about what do I mean by Farm Direct? That means that the principal ingredients are all yours. You didn't grow 1 carrot and buy 20,000 carrots and then start processing them into pickled carrots. You grew all the carrots, and when you run out of carrots, you stop or switch to licensing. And that's a perfectly fine result. If you decide that you want to become licensed, and if you have a place to sell it where you're not growing everything, i.e. not a CAFM site, that's going to work. Okay, so another important thing is that Farm Direct happens in your kitchen. You don't rent a kitchen and do it. Then if you rent a kitchen, then you're going to license. There's some labeling and there's some specific disclaimer language that has to go on the labels, and some of this may be annoying, but none of it is prohibitive. It's just something you have to do. And probably the most important restriction is Farm Direct also means direct sales only. You cannot make a jar of jam and then leave it in a store to be sold. You cannot sell that jar of jam to a restaurant. You cannot sell that jar of jam to a distributor. You can, but you're going to get licensed to do it, or you're going to go to a co-packer or one of the other options that we'll talk about here. So if you want to be Farm Direct, you're going to sell it yourself, face-to-face with somebody. You might take the order over the internet, but the money is going to be face-to-face. So those are some of the main limitations and why this is different than being licensed. You cannot until you license. And the question is, if you need to sell a product that you made under Farm Direct to a restaurant, is that possible? And the answer is no. You need, at the time that you want to switch to selling to restaurants, that's when you need to consider another legal route that is not the Farm Direct bill. And that would be either getting a license and doing it that way, or possibly working with a co-packer, and I'll explain later what that is. I wanted to get through some pitfalls here. These are things that I've observed recently. I feel that it's important for people to understand that we didn't fix everything. We didn't deregulate everything. You have to start from the standpoint of, is it regulated or is it not regulated? And if so, if it is regulated, how much do I have to do? So the one big mistake is just not telling the market manager that you're doing this new product, and then maybe you did something that you could have, maybe you make a mistake that you could have avoided by following our rules and telling me or any other market manager in advance of that. And just because you saw somebody else had it at the market, well, maybe they're licensed. If you saw, like somebody probably last year, I think, saw pasta sauce at the market, the person they saw doing it was licensed. They were not, the person that I was having to talk to was trying to use the Farm Direct law. They didn't do a careful enough job. They assumed it's in a jar, there's somebody else at the market that has it, must be fine. No, it wasn't. Fortunately, it wasn't a huge batch, so they didn't suffer. Improvising on the labeling requirements. This is not time to do your jazz improvisation. This is time to actually read what it says and write exactly what it says in the typeface it says. We were talking about what you can't do. If you go past direct, you have to license. So just don't blast ahead into that without looking into the ramifications of that. Another thing I see is that people have trouble with the fact that we're outside and labels get wet, and so that requires a whole lot of thought as to how am I going to keep these things dry, because it's a really unpleasant task to have to get the old label off of that or smooth down and put another one on top of it. If a label is ruined, it gets really difficult. And you can't just like scoop the stuff out and put it in another jar. That wouldn't be okay. I also want to caution people against just going crazy and starting a whole bunch of things all at once. And you'll hear that over and over tonight. And, buying a lot of equipment. The whole point is to start small, check it out, see if you're getting something within a reasonable cost where you're going to get a reasonable return on it. And do you actually like doing this? Is it not something that you would rather, is it not really something you enjoy doing? Okay, so this is a picture of Bo's Farm where they took their pumpkins and made them into a puree that was used in the jars and also was put into a bread. So they used both laws in one season. The Farm Direct Law is inexplicably divided into these two parts here, and the names for them don't make any sense, and so I'm not going to defend this. Producer processed is somehow supposed to let you know that that's the stuff in the jars and the jams, the pickles, and the fermented stuff as well. So again, I'm harping on that poor pasta sauce thing, but that's an example of something that comes in a jar and it is not covered by the law. That's because pasta sauce doesn't reach the acidity level that a canned product, acidified, a non-acidified canned product needs to have. Okay, so another thing is kimchi. Well, that's actually a product at markets, but the Farm Direct Law doesn't have any meat products. We couldn't sell it to the legislators if it involved meat. And so that meant that no protein products were allowed in it. And so if you have a really traditional kimchi recipe with anchovies, you might want to find another recipe. But the truth is, Americans don't love anchovies that much. Okay. So the things that are on the list you can see are fruit-based syrups and fruit in syrup. You don't see fruit in syrup very much, but it's legal. Jams, jellies, preserves, the whole acidified world. That's where most of the rules come to. This is where you're making something acid that isn't acid to begin with. I don't want to teach like Science 101 here, but just know that most vegetables are not acidic enough without vinegar to go in a can. They need vinegar, or they need to create their own vinegar through fermentation. So that's the last thing. What does lacto-fermented mean? That means that you start a natural chemical process in mostly a vegetable, possibly a fruit, that turns it into something that's just as sour as the one where you put the vinegar in, but you might have massaged salt into your cabbage to make sauerkraut, or other culturally different versions, like is curtido, if I'm remembering correctly. Curtido is a pickled thing that is done. I've done it lacto fermented, and but it would be very much like kimchi, I think, except for its seasonings and so forth. So those are the kind of the three universes of things under the producer process there. A little bit more on that. Again, I'm sorry I'm being repetitive, but if I've done this, it's because I want to really want to ram these things into your head. You're using your own principal ingredients. There's a limit on what goes in the non-principal list, and it's stuff like lemon juice and pectin and sugar that you're not expected to buy. That you're not expected to grow. It is expected that you will buy these things to make your jams, and doesn't mean that you have to use all of the things in the list. But for example, anchovies are not in the list, so that's why the kimchi doesn't have that. So with the acidified, this is where, like I said, where you get the biggest set of rules. The acidified, I was not able to get them to trust you to pick a recipe and just do it. I tried very hard on that. At one point, the Ag Department, this is after the bill passed, and we're in the administrative rules phase, and nobody's paying attention but me anymore, because everybody's moved on. We passed it, that's great, except for the ODA is busily trying to undercut it at this point. Today they're supportive, but back then they're trying to undercut it. And so they say, okay, there's one book in the entire universe that you can use recipes from. And boy, was it boring. So I got another book added. I got all of their extension recipes for the Pacific Northwest added. The other book is called So Simple, and it is from, I believe, the University of Georgia has a whole Center for Home Food Preservation, and they are sponsored by Extension. And so I said, if you don't trust them to do that whole website and everything, why wouldn't you trust them to provide recipes for this purpose? And so they agreed. And so those are the blessed sources. You have one other option, which is, okay, first I'd say, if you have grandma's recipe and you think it's safe, it's got enough acid in it, it's fine, find something in these other sources that is pretty much it. And then you're using one of the blessed recipes. If you can't do that, then you can probably for $50 pay someone to check out your process. But you're going to have to describe all your steps and how you do it and pay the $50, and maybe you can get your home grandma's recipe blessed as safe. Okay, so I wanted to reiterate with records that with these things, you're actually going to be taking some kind of pH records. There are cheap pH meters. I think there are places on the web where we can help you find that if you're concerned that you can't find a pH meter. Lacto-fermented actually doesn't have as many rules. The FDA looked at that a few years ago, and they ended up not regulating fermented stuff quite as much as acidified. And I think that's fair. We wouldn't be in this room together if it weren't for lacto-fermentation. And the reason I say that is civilization needed food before there were refrigerators. And it seems to me that we had to have some ways to get that food before Heinz started putting measured 5% titration vinegar in plastic bottles and selling them at Bimart. So we have to figure out how to keep it cold at the market, whatever it is, because you could, I don't know if anyone here has done lacto-fermentation, you could in theory then can it, but nobody would be happy with you as a customer. The customers would be very unhappy because what they like about lacto-fermented is that it wasn't heated to the degree that you have to heat something to can it. So it's possible, but it's inadvisable from a consumer demand standpoint. Okay, looks like this is just some fun photos here of some stuff. You might notice somebody in the room who looks like the person in the photo there. That could happen again. I'm not sure. Okay. Now, here's the other half of the Farm Direct bill is called agricultural products. Again, not a memorable name. You won't walk out of here going, oh, producer products, ag products, those are different. It'd be hard to remember that. And so here's a whole list of things that are possible to do unregulated now because of the bill, or it was at least cleared up. So even fresh vegetables had that squishy, weird administrative rule. We were hearing it. We were occasionally hearing of inspectors for the ODA, and this is way back, who more than 10 years ago, this all took place, who were saying, "Hey, garlic is dried, potatoes are dried, and onions are dried." And we said, no, not yes, kind of, sort of, but they're cured. And so we ended up putting it in the bill. So that's kind of a weird artifact that I would not worry much about. But if just so you know that there's that kind of drying, which is just your natural post-harvest handling that anybody who grows those crops does. And there's also really drying something in a mechanical way, like on your round or your square indoor dryer that you all may possess. Okay, so, and there are a few other things that are interesting. That there was a farmer who was involved with this who was making a product called Freeka, which is where you take a green wheat and then you burn it. I think it's actually done outside. And so at any rate, some of these things were for particular products. And if we hadn't passed the bill, this guy would have had to seek a specific variance for his product. And he said, no, I want everyone to be able to do this. It's not fair that I only get to do this. Okay, and I just want to acknowledge that one sad thing is that we got more labeling for eggs and honey that they didn't need, but they wanted to make this comprehensive, and so we got a little extra regulation on eggs and honey as a result of the bill, but it was a good trade-off in my opinion. Okay. So dried beans, I explained this earlier, but look at all the varieties of heirloom dried beans that we now have at the farmer's market that we were not having in as many numbers before. There were some dried beans, but there are a lot more now. Here are a couple more examples of things that the bill has allowed. You see in one photo, we've got wheat, barley, and I can't quite read what the next one is. You'll have to cheat. Corn flour. Okay, so these are ground things. None of those had to be licensed because they were sold directly under the Farm Direct bill. And the quince spread is interesting because that vendor started maybe with the Farm Direct Bill for a year, but they, this is Quince Essential at the Corvallis market. They have developed a shipping business, and so they licensed as soon as they could. But it provided them proof of concept. So that's not a Farm Direct product today, or it's sold Farm Direct. It's not solely a Farm Direct product today, and it's licensed, but it gave them a good first step for their first year. What are some? I want you to understand there are differences between the farm products in the Farm Direct Bill and what do we have in the baking and confectionery area. The ODA and any regulators, they actually don't care if you grew anything in your baked goods. That's not relevant to that bill. It is actually kind of a cottage food law. And however, your market manager, would want to know if you were growing anything that went in your baked goods, we'd want to know and help promote that. There are exceptions. Not everything that you can bake can go under this bakery bill. You can't do cheesecakes at the market without a license. You can't do carrot cake at a market without a license because you have a lot of cream cheese in those things. And the legislators didn't sign up for that. So you could start with using the home bakery bill, and then when you wanted to expand to some things that were potentially hazardous, you could go ahead and get a license. And you might be able to keep it in your home even. One difference is this bill requires a food handler card, but if any of you have gotten a food handler card, you can sit at your computer and do the schooling and get your certificate at 3 in the morning for about $15. So it's not as big a deal as the training for other things. Yes.
So for the carrot cake in particular, carrot cake is the actual cake.
I think it's possible that carrot cake itself could go. I think there is a question about how much moisture is in it, but I'm willing to bet that a carrot cake with without frosting or maybe with some alternative frosting might go. So that's a good question. Potentially hazardous has this really long definition. It has to do with water activity level. I'm sure we all know what that is. But you do understand intuitively, perhaps, that foods with more moisture in them are more likely to spoil more quickly. But I would think that carrot cake would be like many other baked goods that are in. Okay, so a lot of the questions that I get over the period of a year are about who's going to regulate this. Let's say you've exhausted all the exemptions and stuff, and you're into the world of regulation. Well, it's a little bit scary because it's not one thing, and you don't know where to go necessarily. In Oregon, about half of the regulatory load falls on the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They do the grocery stores, they do a lot of market vendors, and they do food processing plants and all sorts of things. And then the counties are reporting to the OHA that's up here. That's the Oregon Health Authority in Salem or Portland. I can't remember which, but the OHA side of it, the county side of it, is mostly restaurants. But there's a little bit of gray in the middle there. So that's my lame attempt at lions and tigers and bears, oh my, just in case you're wondering what the oh my is about. Okay, so I'm gonna have to get a little closer to my slide here. So as I said, the first step is to figure out who is gonna license this product, and maybe this product can be done 2 different ways to try to affect how it's licensed. You make some decisions that might reduce your regulatory load. And my mantra is figure out how you can do it to start with the least number of licenses possible. Later, you might want those more licenses because you might want to do whatever it is that they allow you to do. But I never want to see somebody start out with a ton of licenses on something that's experimental. I want them to be able to experiment with the least regulatory load possible. And this is, I think, where I told myself I was going to talk a little bit more about kitchen rental. If you have an issue with kitchen rental, I think that you might need to seek out a little more help than me. But what I have observed over time is generally anyone that rents you a kitchen is not going to absorb your liability. And so you're going to have to get a kitchen license in their facility. So the owner of Honey Brine, where we're standing today, has a license, but that isn't your license, I don't think. I don't think that you could just make an arrangement with the owner here and start going, because you would need your own license. There could be some exceptions to that, and I'm not here to get into fine points, but I just want to give you the broad sense that when you leave these exemption laws, you're going to get a license no matter where you go. Let me see here. One of the tough things, one of our participants that was going to come here is our tamale vendor in Albany, who's also at the Corvallis Indoor Winter Market today. She was the first person in 20 some years that I'm working on this issue who has been able to get tamales licensed to put together in her home with an ODA license. And that was a great thing. She is freezing them and she's selling them frozen at the market. She thaws the few out to cook for samples, and when she's ready, she can get a restaurant license and sell them ready to eat. But for right now, she creamed out the frozen market and said, "This is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to get one license, and I'm going to get going on this business." So I feel like that was a good approach, and she had a lot of good thought that went into that. Let's see, co-packing. Co-packing is when you go to somebody else that already has a license and already has a bunch of recipes figured out, and you take your principal ingredient to them, and then you have them churn out let's go with the classic strawberry jam, Sweet Creek in Elmira. Multiple farmers in the state bring their strawberries to Sweet Creek. Sweet Creek does only a batch of each farm at a time. They don't commingle them until maybe at the end they do commingle them, and then they put the Sweet Creek name on them. And that's, of course, with the permission of the people that sold them the strawberries. But when I say co-processing, what I'm saying is you, the farmer, bring some stuff to a licensed kitchen. They prepare it according to your specifications, and you are legally able to put your label on it. Here's the great part about this is you didn't get a license. They did. They know all that stuff. The bad part, you don't get to pick the recipe. They probably have their recipe, and you might have to talk them into any alterations in it, but that is not necessarily what they want to do. They want to churn out a consistent product, but they're willing to do it with your product, because I want it to be what I call identity preserved. I want to know that it's your farm's strawberries in that jar, just like I want to know that in the Farm Direct law or if it's licensed. The market's feelings about it are the same no matter what pathway you take. We want your product that you're selling and not anybody else's product. But we just want you to be able to pick the way that works for you at any given time. Yeah, probably so. So I've made it. That means I made a mistake there. That the pumpkin in the jar was not a Farm Direct product then. Okay, so we'll have to change that slide there. Maybe I should take some questions before we move on to meat and poultry.
Can you just explain a bit more about the recipe?
Okay, so one of them is a USDA guide to preserving or something. I don't remember the name of it, but that's the one I thought was boring or insufficient for the whole state to work from. And then the next one was the So Simple to Preserve from the University of Georgia. And you should actually, if those of you that are interested in preservation, should go look up that website. I did not put it in my resources, but if you just Google University of Georgia Extension Food Processing or Home Food Preservation, you should be able to find them. And then any extension publication by any extension agency in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't know if that I might include California, but definitely Washington and Oregon. All of those recipes have been blessed. And that, sadly, no. However, pull your ball book out, find the one that's got all the stains on it where you've been using it all the time, and chances are you'll be able to find a USDA recipe that looks pretty much like that, just like hopefully like your grandma recipe that's folded up in the ball book. You'll be able to find one that is pretty much the same thing, because there aren't that many variations on how to do these things. There are only so many recipes under the sun. Under the Farm Direct law, it can only be canned. So when you see fresh salsa at the market, it has been licensed. And I believe the farm that we have that has done the most fresh salsa has had to also get pH testing of it as well, at least at the beginning. I don't know if they had to do that ongoing.
When you say it's been licensed, what kind of license are you talking about?
An ODA food processing license. If we're talking about a farm, we're talking about a fruit or vegetable thing that is in a jar. If you're talking, let me finish this though. If you're, okay, so also, well, a number of the things I've discussed, if they did go to licensing, it would be the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They do have 2 licenses that are specifically labeled as home licenses. One, and both of these are old, they preceded all these bills. One is the home, excuse me, I want to get this right. The home, I'm really sorry. There's a bakery, there is a domestic, excuse me, the domestic bakery has existed in law for a long time. And you, before the home baking bill, that's what you did when you wanted to bake for a local area, use the domestic kitchen license. It costs a little bit less than a commercial bakery license does. Also, there is a domestic food processor license. The problem here is that before this bill passed, what I observed is some agents for the ODA would let you do all kinds of things in your home kitchen, and others were very, very restrictive and wouldn't let much happen. One of the biggest problems we had was that if anyone even uttered the word pickle, they were sent to what's called the Better Process Control School, which cost, even many years ago, it cost, I think, $800 to $1,000. It was offered rarely. There may be an online version today, but back when this issue first arose, there wasn't an online version. It's expensive. The whole thing is 4 days, but I think you would have been allowed to go to 1 or 2 of those days. But you might have to stay overnight somewhere because it wasn't always in Corvallis. So it was a very expensive thing to get trained. And the training you got was so inappropriate. It was for really large scale food processing. You learned things that would help you if you were going to go work in a pickle plant. And we don't have that many pickle plants, frankly. The employment picture for pickle plants is not good. So that was one of my most motivating things, was hearing that my vendors were being prevented from exploring these product areas because of the Better Process Control School's cost. It's a good class for people in industry, but there's much more appropriate training that could be had. So those were kind of big issues for us.
The University of Georgia publication, I think, is called So Easy to Prepare.
Okay, that's not so simple, so easy. And it may not be that easy to get your hands on a copy of it, but it's possible. The public library is another possibility. I think you can check it out at most public libraries and perhaps photocopy a few recipes out of it using your common sense about what fair use of copyright might be. Other questions about Farm Direct and baking?
So that class you were talking about, when I'm certification class, a specific certification class that you have to take?
It's possibly one day of that. And
From my understanding, it's like 300.
Well, it may have come down a little bit. It could be that the 800 was for the whole thing. But we had a vendor who was making mustard and was forced to go to that. Mustard is mustard seeds and vinegar. I don't know. It didn't seem like she needed to learn about the device that's called the retort to do that. We can come back to these things. I just thought this would be a good time to take a breather here, and before we launch into, and I'm not going to do as much on meat and poultry, but I think maybe it'll make the veg people feel lucky that they don't live through what the meat and poultry people have to do. So rule number one about meat and poultry, you'll see up there, is it doesn't make sense. It's not going to make sense. You are parachuting back into some part of the 19th century without any kind of a guidebook if you try to read these laws. Fortunately, we have some people that we can go to who do understand these things. Lauren Gwynn, who is the Associate Director of the OSU Small Farms program, brought with her the Niche Meat Marketing Association. No, the Niche Meat Processor Assistance Network. Sorry. And that she's not staffing that herself. I'm thinking that somebody else we know does. And so if we have issues, we immediately go to them for those sorts of issues. Poultry, I could do a whole talk on poultry, but I'm not going to. There are two ways that poultry could come to the farmer's market. One is that you take your chickens live to a USDA processing plant, and unfortunately, you actually have to sell the chickens to them and then buy them back. And we don't love this, as everyone probably knows. We hate resale, but it's just a paper transaction, and I am very happy that the USDA acquiesced to this because we have a lot more poultry in the markets now. The other way is that you would actually have to set up your own processing plant and get it licensed by the state. And then you would also be operating under a lot of federal rules also that are called the 20,000 poultry exemption. The third way that you can raise chicken but not bring it to any market whatsoever in the state of Oregon is to have 1,000 bird exemption processing situation on your home farm. In that case, people have to come to your farm, and they are free to observe how you do your slaughter and processing, and they have to pick up and pay for the chicken there. You could, at your farmer's market booth that is full of vegetables or full of other things, say, hey, we have chickens for sale. They are sold off of our farm only, and here are the days that you can sign up to get a chicken or 10. And so that's a third route, but it cannot come to the market. And I just want to be, crystal clear about that. It sounds great, 1,000 bird poultry exemption. Wow, I could go into poultry in a small way, but they would not go for that here in Oregon to let those birds come to the market. In Washington, I think they got a little luckier, but don't move to Washington. We need you here. Okay, let's see. So kind of the big three, and there's probably more. I don't know where goat meat falls off the top of my head. Beef, pork, and lamb are all the sorts of meats that, unless you're doing what's called custom, which we'll get into later, if you want to sell beef, pork, and lamb by the piece at the market, you have to take your animals to a USDA slaughter plant, and then that slaughtered carcass has to go to a USDA processing plant, which might be in the same building, but or it may be two different places. And then at the end of that, you get your packages, you pick them up, you bring them home, and you put them in your freezer, and then you'll need a little license to sell your own meat. That is on another slide. So custom meat is another thing we could have a whole talk about, and I would get someone else to do it who is more knowledgeable. But you have to be very precise about it. You're selling something by live weight or something like that. And there are pages and pages of rules about selling custom. We, CAFM, would let you put up a sign in the market that says, we have custom beef for sale. Ask us about buying a quarter or half or whatever. So when you hear talking about people selling halves and quarters of animals, that's what we call custom, and it's got its own set of 19th century laws to go with it. We do have a current problem now. I don't think any of you are in the room, but we're having a problem now where the ODA is not letting the bison and yak and alpaca, which we don't have, not letting those growers have on-farm slaughter like they have for years. They're saying that they have to go to USDA plant, and it's pretty hard to imagine getting a bison or a yak in a trailer. Rabbits are state regulated, I believe. It's funny, there's a chicken and rabbit slaughterer license for the state. And yet chicken and rabbit I don't even know why they're in the same law, because chicken has federal stuff to go with it and rabbit doesn't. So we do have a licensed rabbit operation in our markets, and I believe that she has other animals, but she has to take them other places. And so we can maybe we need to collect that to get you in touch with Julia Sunkler, just to hear about how she does things, and then. But yeah, it is a licensed thing, and there are other. I mean, we have goat. Have I missed any meats that we have represented here among you guys, or?
What about turkey?
Turkey is poultry. Yeah, so that's why it's the 1,000 bird law, or the 1,000 poultry law, or the 20,000 bird law, or the 20,000 poultry law. They count it, and other more exotic things go in there too. I think geese count. There are a couple other more exotic things that I can't think of that fall into this law. And so collectively, if you have a limit like 1,000 or 20,000, every species that you grow that falls in there is under that number. Okay, so pretty much everybody that falls into that, into this world ends up getting what's called a prepackaged meat seller license from ODA. I don't have a current number on what it costs, but I know that the inspection goes something like, well, that looks like a freezer. I'm going to stick my thermometer in that freezer and see if it's a freezing freezer. And when it does, the inspector writes it up and goes away happy. So, so Liz is saying that additionally, besides holding temperature, they want to make sure that it's impervious to outside pests and things like that. Though to me, it seems like it would be hard for a freezer to operate as a freezer if it had a back door for rats. So it doesn't seem likely to me. And then if you haven't done this, it may seem daunting to bring this frozen product to the market, but actually the thick-walled ice chests that we have today are really good at keeping meat cold for the trip to the market, the 4 hours at the market, and the trip home. And one of the additional ways that you make this work is when someone buys something out of one of 4 ice chests, you keep consolidating and shifting, so the mass of the unsold product is keeping each of these pieces are keeping each other cold. And I am a market manager, so I'm always having to buy stuff at the end of the market, and I know that this isn't a problem. And seems like in the first few years when we didn't have very much meat in the market, had a gentleman with Texas Longhorn beef, and he had a bunch of 12-volt batteries and inverters and little refrigerators and carpet and all this stuff. And now we just do it with ice chests. It's a lot simpler. Okay. So you will see fresh chicken at the market, and it has to be, really deep in ice.
Out of curiosity, so where does that fall for people that have crabs?
Catherine's asking about, what about Dungeness crab, fish, that sort of thing. They also have to have that heavily iced at the market, and we have had pretty good success with that. One of our main fish purveyor is doing mostly smoked now, but that's more of a function. It's not because they're having a food safety issue, it's because they're able to stop food waste that way. So I think the food safety issues with fish are keeping it cold at all times. They use dry ice in addition to regular ice. So they might have an underlayer of dry ice and then a top layer of regular ice a lot of the year. Maybe not when it's 45 degrees out, but certainly in the middle of the summer they have to. So it's expensive, but also you buy an ice crusher before before too long. And then you go to Safeway a lot, or wherever you buy dry ice, which I don't think is Safeway anymore. So this set of quotes, these are really about the Farm Direct law. Oh yes, there we go. Got Cameron Ridge up there. I knew there'd be something more. These were quotes from that study of the Farm Direct law. I think we need to move along here. It's another one. Just emphasizing how important this kind of stuff is in extreme rural Oregon. Here's a respondent to the survey talking about, what isn't in her area and why this is so important to be able to bake in her kitchen. Got it? Okay, moving on. Okay, so where are we on, how are we doing on time here? 6:51, okay, need to move a little faster perhaps. This is kind of my formula or my step checklist for product development. Once you've identified it, obviously the next thing you need to do is figure out what degree of regulation you need to deal with now and later potentially. And you need to do the unpleasant task of figuring out how much all this stuff is going to cost. Is there training? Are you going to have to go to a $300 acidified food production class? Probably not. That's the good thing about the stepwise way of starting with these exemptions is you don't have to start that way. You can make a choice to go that way. Try to figure out where you're breaking even. You might decide that it's okay that you're not breaking even, and that would be if you decide that it's doing so much good for your other sales and your business generally that you might be able to put up with just barely breaking even or not. And consumer and market research, I have, I'm sad to say I'm going to be going to a seminar about this on Saturday at the the Small Farm Conference, and I don't have that information to bring you here, but the thought is that when you're doing it's actually about sampling, but it's talking about gathering consumer information after that. And so if you're doing these value-added products, you also want to think about sampling as a way to gather information as to whether it's going to be worth it. And you're not necessarily going to sample forever and ever. You might want to sample just to figure out which things are worth your time. And I think I've said this already, you're looking at this whole thing and saying, is there enough benefit in this for me to do all this work? This is an example of one of our vendors who was joined the market as a small nursery. Maybe they had a little bit of produce. They didn't have enough produce to compete in the size market they were in, but they had enough produce to do pickle and jams, and that's now the basis of the business. And you still have to ask yourself the same questions about whether it's going to work for you. But for them, for this vendor, it actually changed the character and nature of what they're doing at the farmers market. This was a research project that the Food Innovation Center in Portland was doing, sort of a kit for doing market research. I'm hoping that we have a simpler kit coming. I've been told that this one has proven to be a little too cumbersome for farmers market vendors, even though it was hoped that it would work for us, and it hasn't yet. So this is really just mostly my promise. If there is something new that will work for those of you who are doing these things, that I will find a way to bring that back to our vendor base. So what they're aiming to do is get you sensory evaluation. That's people's feelings about the taste and the texture and all that stuff. Figure out how much would you pay for this, for a jar of this that's 8 ounces or whatever. And it talks about this demonstrate market readiness to retailers and investors. That doesn't really fit this talk. Sorry, I didn't cut that out there because we're not talking about that as a goal here. Now I'll leave this slide up for a little while, but we're all gonna have a PDF of this, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I just want to narrate through these resources. The first thing that I would recommend you do is just learn to Google, what can I do without a licensed ODA? And you'll get a page, and it may not be perfect. It may not be, I'm not going to promise every word on it is accurate, but there'll be at the bottom, there's some PDFs, and a couple of them are little white papers about the Farm Direct law, about the bakery bill. And you can answer some of your own questions that way, as long as you have a computer and can download a PDF. I found the next link is the niche meat processing. That's only for you meat people, obviously. It says meat in it. And the next two are different parts of extension where I found some help for processors. The first one said commercial, but it didn't look like it was totally out of whack for our level either. And then the home food safety and preservation, that's really for people largely who aren't going to sell it, but I think you'll get some good ideas there too. We're kind of breaking down some of the boundaries here. I mean, some of the farmers are just home canners who've decided to do some of this in their business. And this last thing, producer process, that's the stuff in cans. This is a flow chart that the small farms folks came up to help you figure out if you fit in the law. And I can do that for you too, but if some of you like a graphic image of stuff, this is where to get it. And don't worry about getting all the addresses down, because we are gonna send this out to everyone. Okay, just my advice over and over again here. Don't go too crazy. You can do one thing or three things this season and a different 1, 2, 3 things next season if you don't like what you did the first one. There's my contact information, and I believe does that look like Leslie's booth? Yeah. I think I picked that because there's walnuts there too. I think I skipped over this, but nuts were a problem. Kids weren't allowed to crack nuts and sell them at the market. Older people who like to watch television and crack nuts, they all thought I was cracked when I said they couldn't do this. So now they can. You can dry things, and you can crack them and put them in little Ziplocs and label them and sell them. So we have time for some more questions.
I was thinking about nut butter, but I just see that as a problematic thing because it's completely raw. And I spoke to a gentleman on Monday who was involved with a recall under what I can tell you processes.
It doesn't strike me as something that I would try to press for being farm direct. It can be a licensed product. We do have some local processors of hazelnuts. Anyone familiar with Freddie Guy's hazelnuts in Monmouth? That is a completely integrated farm to distribution thing. They sell flavored hazelnuts, and at least in farmers markets, they sell hazelnut butter. We have on occasion had hazelnut butter under a licensed person, but I think it's harder to grind hazelnuts up anyway than you think it will be.
It's not
the risk. So let me explain what he's talking about. What is there's some risk in making a butter from raw nuts. Maybe it would be better to roast them, but it's not possible to roast the hazelnut enough to take every potential pathogen out of it without making it into a little carbon ball that you would not want to eat. So So roasting may help a little bit, but it doesn't solve all problems. And I think you sent me an email where we were talking, or a text or something. We were talking about some of the hazelnut growers are doing some kinds of dips or
The ones I told you, they were having that pasteurized in California. They could process it.
Yeah, that's controversial, but you know, the almond industry is facing this. They're trying to figure out how can we still call them fresh almonds if they're pasteurized, and customers are not happy about this.
It just seems to be problematic for small business.
Yeah, that seems like a bit of a leap. I would go with fresh and roasted, and call it good. Well, how are we doing on time here?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. Wow, I thought I was going to run long. So, what can we do with this time? Go home?